Hi folks, in this video we're going to be looking at making easy beach bases perfect for miniatures such as Deepkin or any fantasy mini. So without any further ado, let's cue the music. To start out with, take a vibrant blue colour. Here I'm using Araman Blue from Games Workshop, but the colour doesn't matter as long as it's a nice vibrant blue, and paint over onto the area that you want to be covered in water by the base. The product we're going to be using to apply the water is semi-translucent, and this should help tint the watercolour below. I'd recommend doing a couple of thin coats to ensure even coverage with this colour. Next, as an optional step, I'm coming in with a darker blue and creating a transition between the lighter Araman Blue and the new dark blue. The transition will not need to be neat as we're applying a gel medium over the top. Here I'm just using a wet brush to feather out the two to create a softer transition. This won't be noticeable underneath the gel medium. Once our underpaint in sea colour has dried, I will then be coming in with some texture paint for the beach sand. On this occasion I'm using desert sand from Vallejo, but you can use any light coloured texture paint that you wish, or if you don't have one, a darker one, and then paint it over with a light colour once it's dried. I'm using a spatula to ensure that I have a lot of control on where I'm placing this texture paint onto the base. The nice thing about the Vallejo texture paints is that they are acrylic based. This means that you can take a wet brush whilst the texture is still drying and feather out between that and any other textures or paints that you have on the base. The next step is to add some Vallejo water texture onto the base. Here I'm using Pacific Blue in the colour, and I'm using a spatula to put a blob on and then smush it around onto the base in a layer that's about 2 or 3 millimeters thick. Now don't worry about the patterning on it at the moment, we're just looking to cover the base area that we want to be covered by the sea. Whilst this texture is still wet, I'll be using a toothpick and pressing down in roughly even spaced intervals and dragging it along, not enough to score a line through to the base paint underneath, but enough that we can start pushing ridges together in the texture. And what this is going to do is it's going to start to form ripples or very low waves that look like they're coming up onto the shore. And you don't have to do much of this, it's just enough that you can start to create some even troughs and peaks within the texture paint. Now this texture paint takes a very long time to dry. I would recommend leaving it overnight. It can take up to 24 hours though. Once the blue sea gel has dried, you might find that the colour is a little too dark for your liking. So what you can do is come back in with your original bright blue colour and start with a little bit of paint on the brush, dabbing in a little backwards and forwards motion onto the raised areas where you'd created the ripples. And I'd start by doing a little and then build up the colour with this. The reason that you do it this way is that you can get that nice subtle transitions and you can really get that impression that the sun is glinting on the top of waves. The next step in defining the waves is to take some thin white paint and do some small dabs with the side of your brush on the very tops of the ridges of the texture paint. I'm going straight out of the pot because this is a white paint thinned for airbrush, but you can use a normal white paint and thin it on a palette. And I wouldn't go too overboard with this, it's just to catch the very top and give the impression of sea foam. If you're feeling really adventurous, you can take your white paint with a thin brush and do some small lines to represent the movement of the water. The last step on this base is to make the sand darker right next to the water to represent the waves having lapped over onto the sand. To do this, I've taken some Casandora yellow wash from Games Workshop and thinned it down about 50-50 with water. I'm then washing this right next to the water and about halfway or a third onto the sand. Looking to get nice even coverage and doing a little bit of mixing across into the water's edge. I'm then taking a wet brush and I'm then feathering out the difference between the initial sand colour from a texture paint and the wash. There's no real exact science to this, and you can do it with a very thin wash and build up the colour, or you can do it quite thick and then wick it away using a wet brush. If you're doing a batch of these, it would look better if they were all different, as it gives some nice interest between the different bases. Once the wash has dried, you can come back in with your white paint and merge the washed sand and the blue texture paint to get that white foam as the water hits the shoreline. But that's completely optional, and apart from that, this base is now finished. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one, folks.